Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Clinton. And welcome to everybody, whether you're watching online or for me. It's so exciting to see faces in front of me. It's I feel a bit like you're the first fruits, the sign of the harvest that's about to come when we can all go back together again. So it's. Yeah, I'm looking like an alpaca. Well, thanks very much, Russ. I needed that right there. So welcome everybody. And for those of you that haven't been following us so far, we've just started a new series on the search for happiness. And last week we looked in our second talk in this series at the book of Ecclesiastes, which is an Old Testament portion of our Bible. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, it's describing a very wealthy king, probably King Solomon, who's on this search for happiness or this search for meaning in life. And as part of that search, he commits himself to the search. He thinks, well, maybe happiness is found in pleasure. And he devotes himself with all his energy and all his resources to the search of pleasure. Now, what we find as we look at that search is that he quickly discovers that pleasure doesn't seem to give him everything that he's looking for. And so then he starts on the search for a second alternative. And this is what he says about that alternative in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 to 14. Having searched for it in pleasure, he then decides, well, I'll look for it elsewhere. And he says in verse 12 there, so I decided to compare wisdom with foolishness and madness. But who can do this better than I, the king? I thought wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness. For the wise can see where they are going, but fools walk in the dark. And what you'll find if you go and look at the book of Ecclesiastes is through the rest of the book, this king continues to wrestle with this question: is happiness found in pleasure, or is happiness found in living a wise life? In the end, he appears to conclude that actually living the wise life is the way to go, although he concedes that that shouldn't be done without recognizing the reality of pleasures that God gives us and the enjoyment of those. There's another caveat that he brings into that book that I'll introduce us to last week. But what he's actually doing today with these verses that I've just read for you is describing the possibility that happiness is now found through living a wise life, or the virtuous life, as we've described it for you so far. So let me just briefly revise where we've been so far. In our first talk, we noticed that traditionally humanity has understood happiness as either the pleasurable life or the virtuous life. They're the two main alternatives that have travelled throughout most of human history, and particularly Western life. In our second talk last week, we looked at the pleasurable life. And in this view, happiness is found in seeking a life that maximises our pleasures and minimises our pains. It's all about a life where we intentionally cultivate the positive emotions, like serenity, joy, contentment, all those things. So the pleasurable life is all about cultivating those positive emotions. Now, it should be stressed, and I don't know if I made this point adequately last week, but it should be stressed that advocates of this view don't necessarily think then that people shouldn't pursue meaningful lives. They do actually believe that strongly. They just say that if we can get people into more happier moods, then they'll lead more productive lives. So what they're really saying is the priority is on getting people's emotions right. If we can make people happier, then they'll lead a better or more profitable or enjoyable life. In other words, emotions come before actions in that sense. So make people happier, they'll live a better life. Now, there's a lot of truth in that idea, but it's actually the opposite of the view of happiness that we're looking at today, which is the virtuous life. And I just want to introduce you to that now, to this idea of the virtuous life. I want to give you a definition. The virtuous life, as it would generally be described today, says that happiness is found through pursuing a life of virtue or excellence and realizing our full potential. So happiness is found in pursuing a life of virtue or excellence and realizing our full potential. Now, that idea of happiness is old, very old in fact. We discover it right back in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is written sometime probably around the 10th century BC. So it's old in terms of biblical terms, but it's also very old in terms of Western thought. In fact, it's most famously associated in Western thought with the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC. It's not a very attractive picture of Aristotle, but I presume that's how he actually looked. Now, like the other Greek philosophers of his time, Aristotle was absolutely obsessed with the question of what is life all about? What's the purpose of life? That's the question that completely obsessed the Greek philosophers around his time, was trying to identify what is the end of human existence, or what is the purpose of our lives. In the end, Aristotle concluded, that the goal of life is happiness. The goal of life is happiness or flourishing, and that goal is achieved through living a virtuous life. So what Aristotle was saying is live a virtuous life, and the end of that will be happiness, which is the goal for which all human beings are consumed. Now, the word that he used for happiness or flourishing is the Greek word eudaimonia, which is still the word that is used by modern scholars today when they're describing this good life or the virtuous life. Now, to understand how Aristotle got to this place, we need to recognise that he believed that in this world, everything, whether it be human or non-human, has been made for a purpose. So an acorn is designed or intended to become an oak tree. That's its purpose. A knife is designed to cut. A builder is designed to build. A sculptor is designed to sculpt. So everything has a purpose. And the more that these things, human or non-human, live up to their purpose, then the happier they will be in that sense. So for Aristotle, the greatest happiness is achieved by the person who displays the greatest excellence in being a human being. That's how we get to be happy as a human being. We live to our greatest potential as a human being. So what does he mean? How do we live this life of excellence? Well, for Aristotle, that meant practicing a whole series of virtues that he lists. Things like living with courage, living wisely, living with moderation, living with kindness. All these things are virtuous things. And as we live in that way, as we live a virtuous life, eventually then happiness is something that will come as the outcome of that. But if you go back and read Aristotle, there was also a very dark side to his view, because he held that there were many things that would prevent us from becoming happy. And those things, believe it or not, included being born a woman. So in Aristotle's view, you couldn't be happy if you were born a woman. You couldn't be happy if you were born ugly or born with a disability. You couldn't be happy if you were born in a poor home, because that would preclude you from the resources you needed to actually live a happy life. And for Aristotle to be ultimately happy meant that you needed to have the wealth or the resources to be an independent person and to engage in education, and particularly to engage in philosophy, because Aristotle was persuaded that unless we actually got to that place in life, we could never learn what it meant to be happy. So in many ways, Aristotle's view was obviously deeply sexist, and it was essentially elitist, for his presuppositions about the people who could legitimately pursue virtue and therefore be happy was quite limited. So Aristotle's view of the virtuous life and its pursuit contained many things that, from the Bible's perspective, we would find deeply disturbing and actually very offensive. However, his suggestion that happiness was not found in the pursuit of pleasure, but happiness was found in the pursuit of virtue, has persisted down through human history and into our modern world. And it now sits as a majority view alongside the view that happiness is found through the pleasurable life. Now, in the rest of the talk, I wanted to do two things. I want to give you a modern example of this view of happiness as the virtuous life, I then want to explain the modern emphasis that now characterises this view in our world. So there's our 2 points for today, just 2 points today, a modern example followed by the modern emphasis that is brought by this particular perspective. So let's begin with looking at our modern example. In 2007, the GP turned psychologist Russ Harris published a book called The Happiness Trap. And the book went on to become an international bestseller. It's been translated into more than 30 languages and sold over 100 million copies worldwide. So it's in a book that's had phenomenal success. Now, the title of Harris's book is very insightful in understanding what it's about, or what he is on about. And what he is arguing in the book is that modern people have fallen into the trap, with the way they view happiness. And what you'll find if you read the book is the first half of the book is spent explaining this happiness trap for us. And then the second half of the book is found giving Harris's solution to that trap, or how we escape it. Now, I think that Harris's diagnosis of the modern problem of happiness is particularly insightful. And what I want to try and do is summarise the trap that he describes for you in this form of this diagram that's on the screen there that you can see there. Now, let me warn you, you won't find this diagram in Harris's book. He doesn't actually put it there in that form. What I've done is I've tried to present his argument in a visualised form, because it just helped me to get to the heart of what he was describing. Therefore, as you look at that diagram and as we work our way through it, I trust that I've done him justice in summarising it in this way. I'm pretty confident that it really represents his argument well. And if I've got that right, then really what he's saying is the happiness trap is comprised of 5 steps or 5 stages that we move through. And each step follows or builds upon the other in the cycle. And as we move through that cycle, it becomes quite destructive for us if we don't realise what's actually going on. So let me just work through that cycle, the 5 steps or stages in this trap of happiness that he describes. Now, the first stage in the trap is that we define happiness as positive feelings. All right? What Harris is saying is the first step, well, the way we enter this problem is by defining happiness as positive feelings. So he begins his book by observing, as we've already noted, that people define happiness in 2 major ways. The first, the most common meaning, he says, is to define happiness as a feeling. Happiness is a sense of pleasure, a sense of gladness or gratification. He says a second, less common way to define happiness is as living a rich, full and meaningful life. That's his definition. All right? Happiness is living a rich, full and meaningful life. And from this perspective, he says, happiness is not seen so much as a fleeting feeling, but as living in such a state that we continually take action on things that truly matter deep in our hearts. We live, in other words, a virtuous life. And so he says we move in directions that, in life, we are continually moving in directions that we consider valuable and worthy. He said what we need to do is clarify our values and what we stand for in life, and then act accordingly. And this, says Harris, is the true way to being happy in life. Now you can immediately see how what he's describing for us is the virtuous view of life, or the virtuous view of happiness. He's adopting this view. His definition of happiness is living a rich, full and meaningful life, and then he says the positive feelings, they may come and go, but they will come on the other side of living in this way. So this is the problem, he says, is that most people think of happiness as being positive emotions, and it's the first step in the trap. Now, why is that? Well, that leads us to the second step or problem that he identifies, and that is that our feelings are sometimes negative. He says, whether we like it or not, the reality is that for a lot of us, we live lives and our feelings are sometimes negative. And what you'll do is he reveals at this point that he's an atheist and he's committed to the idea of evolution, but he reveals at this point why he thinks we live in this way where our feelings are quite often negative. Now, the problem, he says, is that when we define happiness as our feelings, we soon discover that many of our feelings are unpleasant. They're not actually happy. And instead of the feelings of joy or peace that we're looking for, we often find actually that we have feelings of fear or of anxiety or of dissatisfaction or of depression even. Now, what Harris says is there's a simple reason for that. It's because of our evolutionary past. Now, you realise that I don't personally share Harris's presupposition at this point that that's how life came about. But I think the explanation he gives can be, I think, more satisfactorily explained from a Christian perspective, but we'll get to that at some point down the track. But just follow his reasoning here. He says the reason our default emotions are generally negative is because when Homo sapiens first appeared on the planet, our number one priority was survival. In other words, our minds didn't evolve to make us feel good, but to survive in a world fraught with danger. So the number one priority, he says, for the primitive mind was to look out for anything that might harm you and then to avoid it. So that's why he says fear and worry are a big part of our lives, because they were built in as a default position from the very beginning of the evolutionary process. In a similar fashion, he says another essential for survival was to make sure you belonged to the group. If the clan booted you out, then it would not long before the wolves would get you. And so belonging to the group was really important. So that's why he says we're so concerned today about what other people think about us and about the fear of being rejected. And then lastly, he says, for the Stone Age person, the general rule for success in life was to get as much food as you can, to preserve as much food as you could, or to build weapons that would allow you to do that. And so, Harris says, it's no wonder that our modern minds are continually looking for more money, a better job, more status, or a better partner, etc., because it's built into us, you see. More is better, and better is better. But then he says that when we get those things, we're constantly dissatisfied because we're hardwired to want better things. You see the point that he's making? He said, we're hardwired because of evolution to want more and more and more and better and better and better. And so today, when we get the better, we find that's not really what we wanted. We're still dissatisfied. So, in some ways, it's quite brilliant what he's doing. He's really trying to trace back all our emotions today as modern people back to our evolutionary past. And so this is how he concludes, and I quote him here. He says, evolution has shaped our brains so that we are hardwired to suffer psychologically, all right? Complete opposite of the pleasurable life. He said we're hardwired to suffer psychologically, to compare, evaluate, and criticise ourselves, to focus on what we're lacking, to rapidly become dissatisfied with what we have, and to imagine all sorts of frightening scenarios, most of which will never happen. So what he's saying is because of our evolutionary past, from his perspective, we're hardwired for negative feelings. So negative feelings like fear, anxiety, dissatisfaction are actually normal. They're actually the default position for human beings. Now, irrespective of whether you buy Harris's evolutionary explanation of those feelings, I don't. And as I just said, I think that Christianity gives a better explanation of that. There's no doubt that all of us experience unpleasant feelings at times, and that these things can make us vulnerable to the next step in the cycle. And the next step in the cycle is we adopt negative behaviours to control negative feelings. All right, so we adopt negative behaviours to try and control these negative feelings. So what he's saying is in order to escape or avoid the unpleasant feelings, then we become vulnerable to adopting all sorts of negative behaviours that allow us to escape or control these feelings. So, for example, in some cases, people turn to drugs or to alcohol as a means to escape the sad feelings or the unpleasant feelings. But other things like, binge eating, excessive work for some of us, excessive TV watching, all sorts of pursuits of pleasure, etc. All these things can become, if carried to excess, very negative behaviours, but we bring them in to our lives in order to keep us from the negative feelings, because the last thing we want is the negative feelings, because then we feel unhappy. Now, sometimes all sorts of very understandable emotions like grief and loss, when someone close to you dies or something like that, they're devastating things. And we can sometimes, in response to those very understandable emotions, develop negative behaviours, maybe like burying ourselves in work, rather than acknowledging it, just burying ourselves in work. It could be rebounding into negative relationships if we've lost someone close to us. It could be becoming addicted to prescription medications, etc. See, negative behaviours often flow from negative feelings, and we're doing all we can to suppress or control them. And so we engage in these negative behaviours. Now, clearly, we can adopt behaviours that are not necessarily negative in order to control our unpleasant feelings. And I think this is where our Christian faith, this is what gets me so excited about our Christian faith, is that I think it gives us the capacity to respond to those things in a way that doesn't lead us into negative behaviours. And that's something that I want to express more for us as we go in this series. But despite that, depending on the situation, we're all vulnerable to adopting these negative behaviours in order to try and control our bad feelings. And this is even more so when we become convinced that the way of happiness is by happy feelings. So whenever our feelings turn bad, then our instinctive response is to run to our negative behaviours to try and control those things, you see. But when these negative behaviours persist or become enduring habits, then they lead us to the next stage in the cycle, which is that our negative behaviours then ironically reduce our overall well-being. You see, when these negative behaviours become addictions or inescapable negative habits, they eventually start to compromise our overall well-being. Addictions generally take a lot of time or energy to maintain. So soon they start to take us away from other really important things that need to be in our lives in order to ensure our long-term happiness. Tragically, drug and alcohol addiction can start to not only drain our time, but drain our finances, to compromise our health and then destroy other important relationships around us. And those things, these negative behaviours don't have to be addictions to drug or alcohol. They can be other actions that we take that take excessive amount of time and start to deprive us of the things that we really need to make us happy in life. You see the point that it's being made here. So it's the ultimate irony. The strategies that we have adopted to decrease our unpleasant feelings in the short term soon start to lower our quality of life in the long term. And that leads us to our fifth and final step, which is that reduced well-being leads to more negative feelings. So as the shame and guilt over our addictions and negative behaviours, along with the damage that they do to our health and relationships, starts to take effect, then they in turn start to create even more negative or unpleasant feelings. So our shame and guilt start to increase our feelings of being silly or weak or defective as a person. And our fears and our anxieties go up as we observe the damage that we're doing by our negative behaviours. And we start to become more and more concerned about what people are thinking about us as a result of that. So soon all the unpleasant feelings that we're trying to get rid of are not only coming back, but they're also being multiplied by our negative behaviours. So that starts the cycle all over again, but at a deeper level than before. So this is the irony and tragedy of the happiness trap. To find happiness, which we assume is associated with positive feelings, we try to get rid of the negative ones. But we often do that by creating negative behaviours. And these negative behaviours end up reducing our overall well-being, which in turn leads to even worse bad feelings, which starts the cycle all over again. Now, the secret to escaping it, of course, says Harris, is to recognise our flawed starting point, that is defining happiness as positive feelings. What we have to do instead, he says, is define happiness as living a rich, full and meaningful life. And this, of course, is right back to where Aristotle's understanding of happiness was first created. That's the virtuous life. Now that leaves us with a question then, and that's the question we ask Harris, is how do we then live this rich, full and meaningful life? Well, Harris proposes that we do this by living by our values. He suggests that we write up a list of values, or virtues in Aristotle's sense, and then start living consistently by them. And he suggests that these values should be applied and come from 4 areas of our lives: or relationships, work, education, leisure, personal growth and health. Now, he says that as we live this way, our feelings will sometimes be negative and they'll sometimes be positive. And he creates in his book a solution to that. The solution to those negative feelings is what he calls acceptance and commitment theory. And that's the theory he puts forward in order to help us with these negative feelings. As Christians, we would see that differently. But the important thing, he says, is to stay focused upon living consistently with our values, and that's how we live a happy life. All right, so what do I think of Harris's suggestion? Well, firstly, I think there's much to commend it. There's positives to it. The first thing I think is that he gives us a stunning diagnosis in many ways of the problem that we have when we make happiness all about positive feelings. And I think that's one of the reasons why the book has become so popular worldwide, is because people can relate to it. It makes sense in many ways. But secondly, while we find there are some obviously very significant differences to the Christian view of happiness, particularly because as an atheist, Harris rules out God from the equation, he nevertheless moves us much closer to the Bible's view of happiness. Happiness in the Bible much more comes out of, or is a byproduct of, righteous living, of living a godly life. And that's one of the reasons why I've walked you over this cycle, is because I think that Harris does take us a lot closer to the Bible's view of happiness. It brings us much closer to that. However, in terms of a negative or a question that we need to ask, here it is. Here's the question. Or it's a negative. How do we know we've chosen the right values? See, that's the question. Harris says, well, this is how you find the right values, and he outlines a task, a process for that. But it's a massive question that all advocates of the virtuous life recognise. It's one thing to say that happiness is found through living an excellent or virtuous life. It's another thing then to say, this is how you do it, you see. These are the things that will make a life virtuous. You see, accepting the idea that happiness is found through a virtuous life still leaves us with the question of, where do I find the advice that I need as to what that life actually looks like? Some people can say, well, this is what I think the excellent life looks like, and describe it to you. Others can say, no, I don't agree with that. I think this is what the excellent life looks like. And then they go on to describe their version of it. Now, clearly, most of us would disagree with some of Aristotle's values, considering the value of women, people with disabilities, or those that come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So we can look at some of his values and say that just doesn't work. Brilliantly, from a Christian perspective, that question is settled, because what we're really saying is that we get our ultimate values from the Bible. And that the God who made this world sits behind the Bible, and he's given us what we need to know in order to live a virtuous life. However, for those who don't hold the Bible as the final source of wisdom, they still need to find their values somewhere else in defining what an excellent life looks like. And that brings me to my second and final point, which is much briefer, and that is the modern emphasis that is brought now in answering this question of where is happiness finally found. Now, as you look at all the modern expressions of the excellent life or the virtuous life, you'll find that nearly all of them have dropped off the idea of living a life of virtue. And what they all do is it's all focused now upon living a life of self-realization, or self-actualization, or self-fulfillment, whatever you want to use to describe it. In other words, and you'll find this is true for the majority of scholars, that are adopting this approach. The majority of them have dropped off the idea of living a virtuous life and emphasised the second part of Aristotle's suggestion, and that is that true human happiness is found in living a self-realised or a self-actualised life. That's Maslow's term, for those of you that know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what they've done is they've focused on that second element of it, of fulfilling our potential. That's how you are happy in life, is by fulfilling your potential. Now, if you listen to all the main virtuous life scholars today, you'll find the majority of them define the happy life as, along these lines, of fulfilling your potential. Happiness is identifying, I'm going to just run through these. These are taken from scholars of this view. One of them would say happiness is identifying one's unique virtues and strengths of character and then developing them to their full potential. Another would say happiness is when we are fully competent, autonomous human beings who are living out their potentialities to the fullest. Another would say happiness is striving to use and develop the best in oneself. Or happiness is being a fully functioning person who is able to succeed in the face of life's challenges. Or happiness is Maslow's self-realisation or self-actualisation. It's the identification and development of all one's highest potential. All right, so all of these scholars are really focusing us in that area and saying this is the way you find happiness, is through self-realisation, self-actualisation. Now, in popular language, we don't necessarily use those terms, but in popular language, it's all about, happiness is all about realising the best you can be. It's all about believing in yourself, having faith in your abilities, making the most of yourself. You know, this is the language that permeates our world. It's all about pushing past the boundaries. You're refusing to accept any limits. It's about being the best possible version of yourself, fulfilling your potential, realising the dream. Now, these are all the common phrases that we use in our world to describe what we mean by this. And what we're saying with these things is that happiness is achieving your full potential in life. Now, hear me carefully here. There's a version of Christianity that teaches that God is not really interested in our individual potential or development. And so that version would say, well, to talk in terms of developing our strengths or realising our potential is just pride or arrogance. Now, I'm going to argue in a future sermon that's not the case. I don't believe that is the case. The Bible doesn't actually teach that. What we're going to discover, I believe, is that the critical question is whether our development is for others or for ourselves. That's the critical question. Am I looking to God to develop potential within me for the blessing of others or for the elevation of myself? That, I think, is the critical question. When it's for others, I'm going to suggest to you in a future sermon that creates enormous potential for personal happiness. When everything that God does within us is developed for the blessing of others, that creates enormous potential for happiness. However, what we have to realise is that our modern approach to happiness, self-realisation, is seen as the great means of our happiness. That's what our modern world is telling us over and over again. Fulfilling our dreams, realising our potential, that's critical for happiness. And without it, our world is telling us you can never be fully happy. And that's why standing in the way of someone's dream is such a terrible crime today. It's not merely that we've frustrated their ambition, it's that we've stood in the way of their ultimate happiness. That's what makes it such a horrific crime. And it's also why parents today can become so angry and so vicious when they perceive that others are standing in the way of the success of their child. And it's not merely that the child is being denied an opportunity for something, it's that they feel as parents that their future happiness depends on that child being successful, you see, because it's all about success. And that's why winning and getting ahead is so important. It's because our happiness ultimately depends upon it. All right, let me conclude with just 2 points. I'm going to suggest to you there's a problem with making happiness all about self-realisation. Next week, I'm going to come back and show you that even those who have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams have not found it's yielded the happiness they've expected. That's the problem with it, you see. It's when we make happiness all about self-realization that we actually start to hear reports back from the really successful ones that when they actually get there, they discover it hasn't given what they're hoping it would give. And so what they're really saying is that somehow it hasn't yielded what I was hoping it would yield. But that's for next week. But let me just make this point as I finish up. I think with these two views of life that we've just discussed in the last 2 weeks, the pleasurable life or the virtuous life, we've really captured the essential way in which modern people today think of happiness. In many ways, we really have two groups of people. On the one hand, we have a group of people that are convinced that the key to happiness is all about the pleasurable life. And these people are often the most spontaneous. They're often the freest people in life. And actually, and in many cases, they're some of the most pleasurable people to be around because they're always engaged in something that brings excitement and joy in a sense. However, it's critical to realise that in some instances that hunger for pleasurable experiences may be driven by the mistaken belief that happiness is all about happy feelings, and therefore in trying to escape negative emotions when they come, in order that they can start to feel happy again, they can start to engage in behaviours that over the long term reduce their long-term happiness. Let me be clear, the Bible affirms very much the need and the importance of happy emotions. The Bible celebrates those things. You'll find that particularly in the book of Ecclesiastes. It celebrates things like joy or contentment. It just teaches us that they need to be the byproduct of something else, not the thing that drives us. The second group of people are those that are convinced that self-realization or self-actualization is the key to happiness. And they're often the most driven people amongst us. They're generally the high achievers, the most talented, the most beautiful. And they're driven to succeed, for they're convinced that happiness lies in realising their dreams, in fulfilling their potential. And this is the problem, as I've just said, the most successful ones, when they get there, start to send back reports to us that it's not yielding what they were hoping it would yield. So there's obviously something else we need for happiness, but that's for next week. All right, shall we pray? Our Father, we thank you for the evidence that we find scattered all over the Bible of your deep desire for all of your children to flourish and to live a life of intense beauty. And Father, we recognise that has all been messed up in many ways by our modern world, and we've become confused about it. We do ask, Father, that you'll give us clarity as we continue to think through these things and to unpack them, and give us the ability, Father, to see things, see happiness through your eyes, to see it through the lens of the Bible, and to discover within it the deep, real meaning of happiness and how it may be found. And so we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.